The views expressed in the following video are those of the individual panel member participants and do not necessarily represent the opinions or position of Empirical Assessment Solutions or the Goldie Company. Welcome to the second in a series of expert panel discussions from the Resilience 2020 project. The Resilience 2020 project was created to seek input from charitable nonprofit sector representatives on their experiences, their challenges, their perceptions, and insights when it comes to the unprecedented COVID-19 times. Our goal is to delve into issues to help spark ideas and initiatives for positive change in the sector and beyond. Our topic today is board governance and key strategies that ought to be used to deal with the impact of COVID-19. With us is Raoul Bardwaj, President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors, Christiane Bolduc, President and CEO of BNP Philanthropic Performance, and Daniel Tessier-Young, Senior Consultant with the Goldie Company. Welcome, everyone. So what are the key issues that nonprofit boards need to focus on as they grapple with the impact of COVID-19?
I think, the way I look at it is there are a number of phases. I think, if we go back to March, April in particular, when the pandemic came about and the disruption became real, I think boards had to consider a number of things. And first of all, being business continuity. I think most boards looked at the situation and said, okay, how are we for liquidity? So there's the business continuity issue, which is of course paired with safety. And we're talking about safety of, could be their clients, but it's definitely safety of their workers, so their actual employees there. So I think those were the two big pieces. And then out of that, I think once things were able to stabilize somewhat, some of course could stabilize better than others. In other words, some went to remote work right away quite successfully. Others were challenged with that, particularly if they were providing services to people in the community that couldn't be done remotely. Then the question had to be, okay, what does the short to medium term look like here? How do we fulfill our mission in doing that? And then the host of questions that come around everything from sponsorship to budgeting for the following year to, are we recipients of government funding? Which way is that going to go? So I think there's the constant balance of the business continuity with providing the services for which, of course, the NFP is set up, whether it's a charity, a foundation, or an NFP, and then, of course, safety, and the safety of the employees being top of mind. And that's not unusual just in the NFP sector. We're seeing quite a bit of that in the corporate as well.
One of the challenges that I saw that cropped up quite often in talking to some of my clients and the people that I'm working with was the issue of communications and networking. And Raoul identified a lot of key points. And that was a significant gap in that process. And boards didn't know what to do or how to go about doing it. And so looking ahead, because these types of issues will crop up again from time to time, not necessarily a COVID-related type, but there are other issues. And so it's an opportunity for boards across the charitable sector, across the not-for-profit sector, to think about business continuity and emergency planning. The other opportunity that I talked to some of the boards that I've been working with was to use this as an opportunity to regroup, to bring the board together and to refocus on key issues and ensure that you're working hand in hand with the staff, if you have that, or at least your working committees or working groups to ensure that the business of the association or the not-for-profit continues.
Yes, I would say that the COVID-19 crisis exposed the necessity to have a contingency plan in time of such challenges. The organization need also to address many challenges that can be summarized in 5 categories, as my colleague mentioned also. I would say finance, it's a big challenge that nonprofit organizations were facing. Human resources also, of course, because you have to deal with your people. Governance issues with the board also. And sanitary question, because of course you need to make sure that your clients and your HR are safe in that kind of situation. And communication, because of course, with not only with your clients, but also with your donors, if you want to keep your donors, to make sure that they continue to give to your cause, they need to be reassured that the needs are still there. They need to be reassured that there is a lot of needs that need to be covered by the crisis, even if the situation was not exactly the same from one sector to another.
And Ron, I'd build on what Christian and Daniel said, in one important way, and that is, around the board management relationship. I think it fundamentally changed, or at least it was brought into a different context as soon as the pandemic came on. So you can imagine there's some, boards that meet quarterly, some will meet a little bit more often. You can have new chairs, you can have been chairs that have been there for a long time, a CEO, ED who's brand new, could be a founder, could have been there for a while. All of these are going to create different pressures on how they're going to immediately start dealing with and communicating around the pandemic. And one of the ones that I noticed come out very quickly was the cadence of meetings. So if you're on a board and suddenly, this pandemic is broken and all of these issues are suddenly out there, you'll have a conversation with the rest of the board and they're going to be, well, what do we need to know? When do we need to know it? There'll be discussions around our fiduciary duty, what's different now than it was before. And then suddenly you're going to have the board look at management and says, well, that quarterly meeting, that's nice, but we need to in fact meet not monthly, but weekly. This is the type of updates that we're going to need to know. We're going to need to get a little bit closer to what's going on. And of course, now you've got board members that have got their own lives, their own health, their own business. And of course, now they're looking to a management team who suddenly they're thrown up in the air to try to figure this out. But at the same time, one of the most important, aspects of communication they've got to get right early in the game is going to be around the board. And I'd say the one thing that I've seen probably most important is the relationship between the CEO, executive director, with the board chair. I think, those two have to come together very closely. So if there are issues in the past, they're probably going to get exacerbated now. But if they weren't, they have a chance to move forward.
Almost overnight, boards had to all of a sudden focus on operational matters. And for most boards, in terms of the governance process, they dealt with high-level policy direction and so forth. And so for many boards, all of a sudden, you're asked to focus on operational matters. And for many of these volunteers, for many of these directors, that's not an area that they focused on before. This is all new to them. And overnight, they had to somehow learn about public affairs, about fundraising, about whatever issues that the not-for-profit or association had to tackle. And that was very challenging for many organizations, especially the smaller ones that don't have necessarily the training or access to the training that they needed to ensure that their directors were on top of this.
And Daniel, would you agree that, in the old world, it was separation of church and state? Suddenly, the board was expected to stay out of operations, management expected them to do that. And suddenly, they weren't doing each other's job, but suddenly that separation of church and state had to be dissolved and people needed to get a lot closer to working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the larger organizations, it was less of a challenge because they could bring in the resources needed to help the board make that transition. But for the smaller one, it was extremely challenging. At least I witnessed that firsthand with some of the clients that I was working with, and I had to step in and provide some last-minute coaching to help them with that transition. So, Raul, you're quite right about that transition and the challenges associated with it.
So, to what extent have organizations been able to meet that challenge?
What I would say is that our message to nonprofit organization was to make sure that to transform that challenges that we were facing with that crisis, that challenges can become an opportunity of change for the organization, because many of them needed organizational changes and shift from an event-based organization to a philanthropic organization with really more major gifts and online donation and other changes to make sure that they adapt to the new reality of our world of today. So that's an opportunity also that we see and that we think that many organizations will need to face. and transform it as an opportunity of change and to succeed in the future.
I'd say probably from our perspective, I'd say two of the biggest pieces to relieve the anxiety of boards was both CERB and the wage subsidy program from the government. So clearly on the CERB side, they weren't creating more clients for a lot of particularly community-based NFPs. And on the wage subsidy, the board didn't have to think about how do they rationalize the workforce right away, because that would have been absolutely disastrous for many of them. They wouldn't have been able to recover from that. I think the question is what happens over the next 6 to 9 months.
Yes, and in talking about that, and one of the things that you said, Raul, at the beginning was that we're going through different stages, and what you've all described has been what's happened. What's going to happen next?
I think the important things to focus on, as Raul and Christian have talked about, is the issue of business continuity and emergency preparedness that I referenced a little while ago. As a starting point, and if not-for-profits and associations can start with this, a very simple task, and that's to refocus on their strategic plan. And that's what I've recommended to some of the clients that I've worked with, and that will have a number of benefits. One of them is to engage your volunteers in a different manner. And we talked about their governance shift to operational matters. And so it will help with that transition, or as that transition continues. The other thing is it will allow you to assess your priorities, or to reassess your priorities, because now things have to be more sharply focused than ever before. A third thing, it will be an opportunity to assign tasks and responsibilities, something that not all boards are accustomed to, because they've relied on staff, they've relied on committees and so forth. Things have changed. Things will continue to change. Use this opportunity to do that. The fourth thing is to reconnect with your staff. And that's very important, because the work that they do really matters. And in these types of circumstances, they need to know that you recognize their effort, because it is very challenging for workers. Many of them have not worked from home before. They need an office environment. They have families to deal with. They have sickness to deal with, isolation, psychological issues. And so it's important for boards to focus on that as well.
Yeah, and I would say also that it's a time when it's very important to inform the board of the situation of the organization, the real situation, and to make sure that they are more operational, as my colleague said also, and require their respective involvement in their area of expertise, to make sure that they collaborate with the CEO to make sure that they have the right plan in place to face the situation.
I think in some cases, even if they get the business continuity conversation, they get a satisfactory answer for that in the short to medium term at least, there's still going to be the broader question that a board will ultimately have to ask themselves is that organization, as constructed in the environment they've got now, in the best position to fulfill their mission? And
right.
That's somewhat of an existential question, but when you start to consider the NFPs and charities that are entirely, let's say, events-based for generating their revenue, Christian alluded to becoming philanthropic, not all of them are going to be able to actually make that transition. So I would be expecting that over the next year to 18 months that you will see more conversations around potentially mergers in the sort as well.
These are volunteer members. To what extent is that going to actually impact board members' ability or willingness to take the risk, to take on the challenges of dealing with their organization?
At my end, with some of my clients, indeed, some of the staff, not the staff, but the board directors and volunteers have stepped away, because they're overwhelmed with what they've been asked to do. For many, it's much more than they signed up for. And without the proper training structure in place, many are stepping away and saying, this I need to pause, or I need to get out of this because it's too much for me. And so this is something that boards will have to deal with, because more and more demands will be placed on volunteers, on these community people who step up and want to help a particular not-for-profit or a charitable organization. And so they have to rethink how they recruit people and how they train those individuals, and to prepare them for the eventuality that other things may happen that may be disruptive and to have a process in place along the lines of business continuity and emergency preparedness to help them with that transition. Without that, without access to those tools, without access to that training, I suspect that charitable sector is in for a bumpy ride in the years ahead.
Yes, I would say that we saw, of course, in some cases that board members were overwhelmed by their own situation in their business. But in many cases, we saw also generous people that provide a lot of time to their task as board member, and were very generous to provide their expertise, and we're very happy to help the organization to make sure that they are facing the situation, even if it was not very easy to do.
And Ron, I would add to that to say it's not unusual for any company, whether it's charitable or NFP or otherwise, that if the board feels that they're getting into a dire situation from a business standpoint, to revisit their directors and officers liability insurance. And when they do that, not all the boards and directors come out there feeling positive about their future when they start to reevaluate their own personal liability as well. So I would expect that there are going to be some who, through the burden of what they have to do, plus purely from a liability standpoint, might say, this is not what I signed up for.
Raul brings up an interesting point in that a lot of board members, especially at the community level, step up and they want to do something, they want to help, without necessarily realizing what their legal and regulatory obligations are. And this is a period where some of that will become more evident. And as Raul pointed out, as that becomes norm, it may force some of these volunteers and directors to pause and reflect about their own individual commitments, because this may be too much for them at this time.
You talked about the idea of mergers happening, and to what extent has change actually occurred at this point?
Yeah, we saw some more collaboration, and we are seeing right now organizations that are talking about that.
Ron, in our experience, to build on Christian's point, absolutely they'll be starting to look at it, but this isn't in the ordinary skill set of most board members either. So it becomes a very theoretical discussion. Without experience, you don't know necessarily when to begin that conversation. And of course, it's extraordinarily disruptive to management. You've got a not-for-profit that's providing services typically to, community members or people, which are very difficult to do in a social distancing environment to begin with. Suddenly your revenue could be drying up. You don't see that, changing in this environment as well. And board members don't always appreciate what their alternatives are. And that's a very difficult conversation to have with your management team, to sit down and say, I know you're a founder of this NFP. I know this is, a great direction. We've built this all up, but we don't have confidence that we can continue going forward. And you look around the board table, and I'm telling you, most folks around the board table are not accustomed to operating in this environment, much less actually seeing a merger through from beginning to end. So this is all new territory for a lot of not-for-profits.
Raul raised a good point about mergers and so forth, and I have a question for our guest panelists here, and have they looked at other options as well? Strategic partnerships or alliances, staff sharing, and things like that. I'd be really interested in knowing of your views in that regard.
We will see those kind of strategic alliance more and more in the future, not only a merger, but some kind of strategic alliance, collaboration between organizations, because at the end, the donors, what they want to focus is to make sure that the needs of the community are answered, not that we multiply the number of organizations.
And then you raise a really interesting point there. I think to the extent that there could be sharing of space that happens, sharing of resources, back office, you'll see that happening time and time again. I've seen that. My own experience in not-for-profits and charities are they work really hard to build their donor base, to build their asset base, to build their revenues. It's really tough to get them to really share that and to join others strategically if it means giving up that pipeline of revenue or those relationship with donors. So it may actually end up being there out of necessity, but I don't think people are going to welcome it. It's a tough river to cross.
There are lots of tools out there for organizations to leverage, but they may not be familiar with those. So how are they going to access the material that they need for training purposes and business continuity and so forth? And there's plenty of wonderful organizations out there that provide that, and many at low cost or no cost. However, not everyone has access to that information because they don't know where to get it. And so a lot of these not-for-profit organizations are very small. Most, in fact, probably don't have staff people to worry about those types of things for them. And so if you're a volunteer and you've already committed your maximum hours for that particular organization for the week or for the month or whatever the case may be, you don't know where to start, and collectively the board may not know where to begin, and so you're wasting a lot of time there. And so at some point we have to reach out collectively. Somehow we have to reach out to these organizations and let them know that there are tools available to them, there is training available to them, there is help. How that's done, I think, it would be an interesting conversation.
I think, Daniel raised a number of points. The tools are certainly out there, the knowledge is certainly out there. But these organizations are typically very capacity constrained. So if you're an executive director or in a small organization or even a mid-size, you're spending so much of your time right now managing your board, managing your team, trying to keep the wheels on the bus, try to service, your mission and your clients and work on it. And now suddenly you're being asked to consider something called a merger, which could at the end, end up with you not having your role, having to completely let go of your staff. Everything changes upside down. These are very dire consequences for someone to contemplate. So I think a lot of organizations are really busy, and to do these properly actually requires some planning. It really requires some real desire to move in that direction as well, as opposed to the circumstances saying you have to move in that direction. So, I agree the tools are out there, but in a capacity constrained environment that's asking already a lot of people that we're already asking a lot from.
There are also some legal requirements as well, and that brings on some added costs to the whole process that boards need to think about before they even go in that direction.
So you're not painting a very positive picture here, because it sounds like they might go kicking and screaming to that. Maybe the outcome is going to be predetermined before they actually realize they should have worked towards a merger or something like that.
My own take on that, Ron, is some will succeed down that path and some won't. And it might not be for lack of desire to get there. These are not easy. These are not easy choices to make, and they're not easy to actually put in place. And even if they're in place, there's no guarantee they're going to succeed as well. Because if we were talking about this outside the context of a pandemic, we would say that merging two organizations, there are cultural issues, there are donor issues, there are all sorts of issues, and that's in a good situation.
Yeah.
Now that you put it in a challenging situation and everybody's capacity constrained, that just makes it all the more challenging.
What qualities of a board would be necessary for increasing the likelihood of being able to appropriately assess whether the merger option or some of these other tools can be successfully undertaken?
I would say that it would be very useful for a board before taking that decision to obtain external advices from external consultant, but also a legal advisor, communication people, to obtain those kind of advice to make sure that they take the best appropriate decision. And if we want to succeed that step and that initiative, it will be better to make sure that everybody are on the same page, everybody are focused on to provide and to answer the needs and the mission of our organization, and it will be better served by a merger and other kind of collaboration than it is with our own organization. So we need to have board members that are very open-minded to those changes.
I think it's also an opportunity as well, purely from an organizational perspective, in that it will force organizations, these not-for-profits and these associations and charitable organizations, to think about their future. And collectively, I think that thought process is going to strengthen the sector. It's not one that easily adapts to changes, easily adapts new technology, that sort of thing. And collectively, I think this is going to give us a golden opportunity to come together somehow and make the whole sector stronger. It's going to take a lot of years, it's going to take a lot of training, but this is a significant event that's going to force everyone to rethink about their future, and some good will come of that.
To add to those, and because I agree with everything I've heard so far, is I would say it puts a premium on empathy and on leadership, and particularly the leadership of the chair. Earlier, Daniel had spoken about, volunteers on boards. If you're a chair of an organization that's particularly precarious right now, you have no choice but to question your own commitment and to step up, and it's a test of your own leadership. How you're going to lead the board and thinking about this, but in an empathetic way, so you're actually working with management. I don't think this is a time when the board can go off on its own and come up with its own conclusions. It has to be far more collaborative than perhaps people have realized in the past. But I think, empathy is really, really important here. Nobody brought this upon themselves. There's no question of competency. These are externalities. These are dramatic externalities, and people need to be mindful of that.
Empathy. And what's the role of trust in this as well?
Personally, without empathy, you're not going to get trust. And wherever it goes in an organization, your employees, they will remember how they were treated through this time as well. And, not everyone is going to come out as, a new strategic alliance or a merger. They're going to continue on their own way, and they will remember how they were treated, and that relationship's really important. So I think it's all founded on empathy, which will build trust.
What I would say is that those kind of steps, and if you want to think about a merger of organization, it must be a win-win solution and not perceived as a takeover. So the trust is very important at the beginning, that to make sure that you have a win-win solution. And at the end, maybe for many reasons, the merger is not the only option. We must think outside the box. And I would say in one of my experience I had with such discussion I had with two foundations, and that were focused on healthcare and housing services, and also fundraising activities, of course, to fundraise their services. They have decided to split those missions. So one organization has decided to focus only on providing services, and the other organization has decided to focus only on fundraising activities and to fundraise the healthcare institution. So they have decided to change the way that their mission was built for both organizations, and at the end it was a success for both.
Not-for-profits should keep in mind is the community they serve, and to open that door much wider than it is now. Oftentimes they serve a community, but at the board level, they don't have that community on the board representing their interests or being part of the decision-making process. And that has to change for a number of reasons, obviously, from my perspective. And so this situation is going to give not-for-profits an opportunity to rethink how they interact with the communities that they serve. And they may be surprised at the end result. And right now I'm dealing with a couple of clients, and I've been asked to talk to their communities. And surprisingly, there's a gap. And that was shocking to many of the volunteers, or the directors, I should say. And so let's not lose sight of the communities that we serve and ensure that they are part of the process and are able to contribute and feel welcome to contribute to that decision making.
To what extent are boards actually sharing and looking for best practices and comparing strategies? You've described boards working fairly independent, and that's sort of the culture, the nature of it, because their domains are very specific. But to what extent has the COVID experience caused boards to look at what others are doing?
In my experience, I can say it may not be board-to-board conversations, but if I speak about my own board at ICD, all of my board members are volunteers, but they're on a number of other boards So every time we meet, we're getting the benefit of them sharing their experiences from all of the other boards. And as you'll know very well, that often board members sit on multiple boards. So a lot of those learnings are being shared. And I'll say at ICD as well, we're hosting a lot of panel conversations and convenings to provide a platform for people to ask questions, share ideas, so they can share the learnings right now too.
I think it's important for not-for-profit boards to think about how they can share and how they can ask as well, inquire, share that best thinking, share those best practices, make a point of doing that as best as you can and as much as you can given the circumstances. But it will be up to some of the larger organizations, those not-for-profits who are in the business of providing coaching and leadership skills and tools and so forth, to try and reach out to as many organizations as possible to get that dialogue going. And Raul talked about things like webinars and accessibility and so forth. All of that is out there, but it's really difficult and challenging for some of the smaller organizations. So the more this gets talked about, the more information is shared, the better off everyone in the sector is. And as I mentioned a little while ago, we'll come out of it a little bit stronger, or perhaps a lot stronger.
I find the last few years, more and more organizations that wanted to improve their governance and to adapt and to adopt also the best practices for their own organization. And I can see also a trend for many organizations to adopt some standards for their organization, such as the Imagine Canada standards. And it's interesting because those kind of standards are adapted to the size of the organizations. So that's, I think it's the good way to adopt the best practice for the organization.
You know, if I'm sitting on a board now, as I do, there are no easy or obvious answers. So, you know, it's good to look around the landscape to see what others are doing, but now's not the time to say that their situation is exactly our situation. And quite frankly, there are a number of things that have yet to play out in the fall. Is there a second wave? Is there a second wave of government funding? You know, does the economy get back through stage 3 and continue on and everything move back and we normalize? What does the new normal look like? So there are a lot of uncertainties. So some of the more dire consequences that some boards may be thinking about, it might be important to have that in your back pocket, but that doesn't mean now's time to necessarily action those.
I thank you so much for this conversation. Some key points, the empathy part, the sharing, the best practices, the uncharted territory that boards are facing right now. It's a daunting time. I think one of the clear messages is that we're all in this together because it's uncertain where things are actually going. And so I thank you all for sharing your input, your ideas. This is the exact purpose of what the Resilience 2020 project is all about. And so I thank you very much for taking time to lend your insights into this issue. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Ron.
Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have any thoughts on some of the issues that were raised, please leave a comment below. We tend to add new content about once a month, so if you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing. And if you have some ideas for future topics, please email me at the address listed below. See you next time.